When it comes to deities, witches have quite a different way of connecting to their gods and goddesses than perhaps subscribe to the Abrahamic religions. Rather than viewing our deities as these punishing or rewarding all powerful beings, we look at them as more of magical allies that help aid our magic and our spellcraft as well as our life in general. So, in tonight's episode, we are going to be talking about different ways to choose patron deities as well as how you can connect to and honor them. So, Merry Meet, I'm Aislin. This is Ask Aislin, and I'm here tonight talking about all things deity. So, welcome to those who are joining us live. I could say hi in the chat. I see Kurt is here. Merry Meet, Kurt. So, welcome to everybody joining us. And we have quite a bit to cover, so we're going to dive right in. But first, if you are with us live, you can leave questions and comments in the chat. As always, we have a Q&A at the end. And even if you're not here with us live, leave your questions there as well. I go back later and I answer all of those. Make sure to leave a heart or a thumbs up somewhere in the video, and that way we can make sure this gets out to the feed of more people. So let us dive right in and we'll get started. So we're first going to talk about different types of theism. We're going to talk about different ways that we can connect to deities, and we will also talk about ways to honor them and offerings that we can leave for them. And just saying hi to some more who are joining us that I see in the chat. I see Tabitha's with us, and Andrea, and Cindy. Merry Meet, everybody. I'm hoping that the audio is sounding okay right now, but just let me know in the chat if at any point it goes off. We are working to correct this for the next time. I kind of dropped the ball and didn't get the right correcting wire this time, so hopefully we're going to be okay. Merry Meet, I see Glitter is also with us. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. And the first thing we're going to talk about is types of theism. So this episode tonight is a kind of summarized version of a class, multiple classes that I teach inside of our Demystifying Witchcraft course. So if you are not a student of Demystifying Witchcraft and you think you might be interested in the course, listen at the end. I'll be telling you details about when that is going to become available to the public. But let us dive right in. Now we're going to be talking about types of theism, and the most logical place to start is with monotheism, mainly because it is the preferred type of theism at large in the world today. That doesn't mean that it is the only one. It doesn't mean it's the best one. And I'll be sharing my thoughts with you on why I actually don't think it is. But we will begin here. So monotheism is the belief in the existence of one deity. And we'll be talking later. There are other forms of theism where people work with one deity, but they acknowledge the existence of others. In monotheism, typically the existence of other deities is either not acknowledged, or the other deities are thought of as being false deities, and the one that is chosen for the monotheistic religion is the correct one, at least from the view of the adherents to that religion. So the Abrahamic religions of the world today practice monotheism. There is some talk you will see this in some scholarly work. People will talk about monotheism as being a more sophisticated form of theism. And first of all, just to back up, theism is just the belief in some type of deity. But even in The Golden Bough, which was written by, blanking on his first name, but Fraser was the last name. This is a great book that is considered a reference point. It's kind of a difficult book to read. For those of you who've read it, you know what I'm talking about. It's very dense. But it is a book that many of our modern pagan authors have read and then have drawn material from that book. But even in that book, there is a part in the book where he talks about this idea that monotheism becomes kind of a more sophisticated religion, or a sophisticated form of theism, and that those who were still practicing polytheism would be considered less sophisticated. Now, in my opinion, and this is my opinion only, But in my opinion, I think that this is a very conquering mentality to have, right? To say that like one conquers over, or one form of theism is better than another form, or more sophisticated than another form. It also tends to be the mentality of a conquering group of people, that whatever they provide is better than whatever the people they're conquering had before them. And that includes theism, that includes the choice of deities. So um, I feel that this particular form of theism really leaves no room for any other views, and could be contributing to one of the major conflicts and problems in our world. So, on the other hand, we have polytheism. Now, polytheism exists long before monotheism. Polytheism is the belief in the existence in more than one deity. Now, there can be both hard and soft polytheism, and we'll be talking about the difference in just a moment. But some examples of groups of people who practice polytheism today are Hindus. Hinduism is considered a polytheistic religion. Wicca, anybody who's practicing witchcraft or traditional witchcraft who also is working with deities, tends to practice polytheism. Druidism, Shinto, Candomblé, there are a lot of contemporary religions that are practicing polytheism today. Now, polytheism, and I just should back up and say that is not an all inclusive list I just said. Now, polytheism can, as I said, can be hard or soft. And there also is this idea that um, when we practice, you can practice polytheism and you can work with multiple deities together, right? And they can be deities from many different pantheons. And as we go further, I'll be sharing more of my own practice, which is eclectic and draws on deities from different pantheons. But there is a polytheism as well, where you believe in multiple deities. You believe that they exist, but the one that you have chosen and that you have this relationship becomes sort of your deity, but you're not negating all of the other deities out there like you would be in monotheism. Now, there's also dualism, where there are two sort of extreme complementary opposing forces in the world. Typically, one is evil and one is good. Now, this is different than kind of classic monotheism, where there's sort of a god, and then whatever evil forces are underneath that god. In dualism, we just have these two opposing forces that have equal power. Now, Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism would be good examples of that. These are religions that tend to not really be practiced in wide groups of people. They're not as popular as our polytheistic religions that most of the contemporary modern pagans are adopting. Now, there's also animism, and what you're going to notice here with some of these, people who practice polytheism may also find themselves to be animists. So, for example, I believe in animism. Animism is the idea that there's spirit energy that essentially resides in all things, it animates them, it brings them to life. So Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, neopaganism, this is not an all-inclusive list, as I said, but these would be religions that practice animism. Now, agnosticism is the acknowledgement that there is potentially something out there. There is some kind of higher form, some deity of some kind, but it's the belief that neither negates or kind of proves any form of deity. And many people who are agnostic will say, I imagine that something exists outside of myself, but I don't know what it is. And sometimes people don't really trouble themselves with it. Sometimes it feels more like it's something that they will approach and they will question and they will research at a future time in the world, but they don't negate the existence of deity. And then finally, there is atheism, which is the belief in no deities. So let us move. The rest of this episode, we're going to be talking about polytheism, and that is because the majority of witches consider themselves polytheists, whether that is hard or soft. So let's talk about what is the difference between hard and soft polytheism. And as we go through this, if you're live, you can feel free to chime in the chat what kind of, what do you consider yourself? Are you a hard polytheist? Are you a soft polytheist? Where do you fall in this spectrum? And just saying hi to a few more people. I see Rebecca is joined us, and Amy and Cindy said the audio is sounding good so far. So that is great news. All right, so in hard polytheism, there is this idea that each deity is real. It's a distinct being with its own personality traits, with its own history, with its own stories. Deities, when it comes to hard polytheism, deities are not considered archetypal, and the deities are not all coming from the same god. Now, that is countered with soft polytheism, where there is this idea that the universe has this sort of creative force and creative presence, and that some people will call this great spirit. They might call it divine spirit. They might call it creator, universe. You could just plug in whatever word it is that you use. But the idea of the great spirit, that animating force of the world, is fairly complex, and it's difficult for the human mind to understand. So, in order for people to be able to receive connection and communication with deity itself, from that one spirit, that kind of universal creative energy, manifest into various other deities out in the world. And the deity breaks off in this way so that it becomes more accessible to humans. It's much more easy, usually, for the human mind to understand a deity like Hecate, for example, than to try to grapple with understanding universal consciousness. We can form personal relationships with the deities in this way, in a way that we can't really form with through just energy, right? Now, in soft polytheism, the gods and the goddesses all are considered to come from the same place, and they are all forms of that same energy. Now, certain gods in one pantheon, they manifest as different forms in other pantheons. So this is where the hard polytheist and the soft polytheist will disagree. So the hard polytheists will say that even deities that seem similar in multiple pantheons are very distinct, unique energies that really don't have any connection whatsoever. It's sort of like saying your sister and you, even though you may share qualities that are similar and you have very similar genetics, you aren't the same person, and you aren't manifestations of the same energy. So that would be more like hard polytheism. Now, in soft polytheism, the idea is this energy, sort of like, let's say, the energy of motherly love, or love, let's use that as an example, sort of manifests itself from the universe, from that universal creative energy. And then in each of the separate pantheons, it's going to manifest it differently in order to connect to the people who are part of that culture, or who worship that pantheon of gods. So in this way, Venus and Aphrodite, it's easy to see how similar they are and how connected they can be. And we can actually trace back stories that suggest that they do probably come from a very similar place. But even deities far away, like Lakshmi or Freya, who share the qualities of Venus and Aphrodite, are thought to be one goddess, but manifested in different forms in different pantheons in different cultures. So there really isn't, when it comes to hard versus soft polytheism, there isn't really a right or a wrong way to look at it. It's just simply, how do you look at it? And what you'll also notice is that polytheists, like, I would say, of the majority of polytheists that I have met, the vast majority of them fall into the soft polytheist category, though there are hard polytheists. In fact, we have someone in our coven who is a hard polytheist. And what you will notice, though, is that you don't see the kind of fighting between hard polytheists and soft polytheists that you might see outside among kind of those monotheistic religions, who constantly fight over whose God is the right God. And just on an aside, and I just wanted to mention this because I find it so fascinating when people fight over deity, because it doesn't take a lot of kind of communing with deities to connect to them and understand that they find the fighting very foolish. They don't really understand what the fighting is about. Because from their perspective, they're all coming from the same place. It's all worshiping the same thing anyway. So we're the ones, these humans with these small minds, who are choosing to fight all the time. But I've brought this topic up with other, you know, polytheists, witches, pagans that I know, and I've found others say the same thing when they connect to their deities. They kind of get that same message. They don't really quite get what all the fighting's about, but we nevertheless persist in fighting down here on Earth. Now, one thing to also consider, and I'm not going to go into this in great detail today, but talking about archetypes, we do have 2 previous episodes I'm going to refer you to if you want to study and learn more about deity archetypes. But let's talk about deity in a neo-pagan context, since the people who are watching this live and follow me tend to consider themselves neo-pagans, witches, pagans. So as I mentioned, Great Spirit, this unifying universal force, which is kind of difficult for us to grasp as a concept, as a personal, something to personally connect to, manifests itself into these 2 energies, the goddess and the god. And so this is more from a neo-pagan perspective. Now, the great goddess and the great god then manifest themselves into other forms. So the great goddess will manifest herself into the triple goddess, maiden, mother, and crone. And we can choose to work with any one of those forms depending on the need that we have, the way that we want to connect to deity, perhaps even the phase of life that we're in at that time. And or we can work with the goddess as the triple goddess, which encompasses all 3. Now the god, the great god, will manifest himself into the light god and the dark god, and much of this has to do with the certain intentions that he rules over. So when we are perhaps looking at the light god, we see many of the deities that become present from Yule to Litha during that growing half of the wheel of the year being present when we're thinking about the light god. And then when we're thinking about the dark god, the deities who are more connected to the dying half of the year, those who might be connected to the underworld, for example, deities that we might work with in our shadow work. These deities are more connected to that period of the time of the year from Litha to Yule, when we're in the waning half of the year. Now, you can work with these universal energies. So, and I think this is important too for those of you who want to connect to a deity, but maybe you haven't found a patron, you haven't settled on one that, kind of speaks to you or calls to you, but nevertheless you want to work with deity. You can work with the great goddess and the great god, or you could choose to just work with the triple goddess. You could work with the maiden, the mother, the crone. You don't have to get specific. You can work with the energy at that level. If you want to work with a god and you aren't really ready to choose a specific god, you can instead work with the great god, or you can work with the light god, or you can work with the dark god. And so this opens up a lot of possibilities in polytheism that you don't have in monotheism. Now, if you become interested in kind of looking at these sort of archetypal energies and how to work with those, as opposed to individual deities, I invite you to check out episodes 110 and episode 113, and you'll find them everything conveniently. It's much easier to find it than in our group. It's easier to find it on our Body, Mind, Witchcraft YouTube channel. So just go there and you can find episode 110, that's the archetypes of the goddess, and then episode 113 is the archetypes of the pagan god. And that will go into much more detail that we're not going to go into tonight. So what I want to do with the remainder of the episode is I want to talk about ways to connect, because of all of the probably topics that I get asked about, this is one that I get asked about the most. When I send out emails about connecting to deities, they get more clicks. when our YouTube videos about gods and goddesses get more views. So I know that there are a lot of people who are hungry for this information, and you know, they want to know how to connect. So whether you are somebody who has worked with deities for years and years and years, or you're brand new to this and you're wondering how to work with them, hopefully there will be something in the remainder of the episode that will give you some idea. And the other thing I also wanted to mention here is that you can be a witch or a pagan and you don't actually have to work with deities at all. So that's a question that I also sometimes get, like, what happens if I don't want to work with one? You don't have to work with one. That's the beauty of the craft, is you can choose how you want to work, and you don't have to choose to work with deities at all. But for those of you who do want to work with them, you are going to discover that there are a lot of different ways that you can work with them. So I'm just going to pause here for a second too. Cindy said she believes that Cernunnos, who is a god that she works with, was watching over her last Friday when her car was totaled. And I believe that too. I believe that the deities that we work with do become very personal to us. You know, like I mentioned in the beginning, these aren't like punishing and rewarding gods that we think of in the Abrahamic religions. These are deities that become close friends and allies of ours when we work with them long enough. And I believe too, just like with Cindy, at the moments when my life has been threatened, or in particular when my life has been threatened, I have very much felt the presence of deities near me. And for example, when I had my ectopic pregnancy a few years ago, and I was being wheeled into the operating room, I saw Ganesha at the end of the hallway, and I knew that he was present and there with me. So and watching over me during that surgery, and thankfully I survived it. So I do very much think that these deities can be present with us and can be near us in very profound and personal ways. So let us now shift. I see Taliesin has joined us as well. Merry meet. So let us shift our kind of attention now towards, well, how do we connect with these deities? So as you travel the path of paganism and neopaganism, witchcraft, Wicca, you may find that some deities speak to you at different times of your life when you are on different parts of your path. So for example, a person who has some profound healing that they need to do may find that healing deities start to kind of come into their mind, or people will be talking about them around you, or you'll be places and just through synchronicities, you know, these kind of healing deities sort of pop up and become present. In any intention that you can think about, like let's say a person who was working towards abundance, then they might find that sort of these deities are tied to abundance are sort of popping up in synchronous ways around them. So how do we choose a deity? There are many different ways, and so let's start by talking about some different ways to connect. How would you choose one? I'm going to share with you some ways that I found some of my deities, and I'm also going to share with you some of the deities that I haven't really started working with yet, but they've been sort of in the periphery of my mind, sort of speaking to me and making it known that their presence is there, and that they would like to work. So the first way to pick a deity is through studying pantheons. And so I think this can be a really accessible way for people who are newer to the craft, or people who, you know, maybe you've been on the path for a long time, but you really never have found a deity and you really don't have any idea how to find one. So I think this is one of the most accessible ways. Here, you are drawn to a specific pantheon. So you really open up your mind. You think about the myths that you enjoy, and you begin to study more about those pantheons. So let's suppose a person is very, very drawn to Egyptian mythology. They've always loved the stories. Maybe they have a kind of a periphery understanding of some of the deities, but they're drawn to that pantheon. So what you do is you begin to learn the names of the deities of that pantheon. You begin to learn more about their stories. You learn about their relationships, who likes who doesn't like who works together. And you really try to immerse yourself into that pantheon, and that can actually extend into the culture as well. So if you had that inkling of wanting to study the Egyptian pantheon, you might begin to study the Egyptian culture as well. Perhaps you would start learning a bit about hieroglyphics, or you might start to learn more about the language or the foods, and you just really immerse yourself into the culture of it all. You may find that you are drawn to a pantheon that is very similar to the culture of your birth, or you may find that you are drawn to a pantheon that is very different than the culture of your birth. I feel that when we are drawn to things, it is not wrong to explore them. People have asked me that before. What are my feelings on, exploring the deities of other cultures? And I feel like any time that we come to the practice with reverence and respect, and an open mind and curiosity, there's nothing wrong in our explorations. Another thing to consider is that, frankly, many people who believe in reincarnation, which is probably the vast majority of witches, don't really believe that we incarnate over and over and over again into the same family and into the same culture. And in fact, I have recovered past lives from various different cultures all over the world. So it can make sense why we would be drawn to deities of different cultures and different pantheons, because these were deities we worshipped and we worked with in other lives. So when you work with the pantheon, you can work with all of the gods of that pantheon. So you can kind of say, let's say you're somebody who is really into the Greek pantheon, and you just work with all those deities, or the Roman pantheon, you work with all the Roman deities, and maybe you choose the ones that you work with based on the time of the year, based on holidays that were where those deities were worshipped. So this is where you can really go all in and do a lot of research and find out, when were these deities worshipped, what holidays were they worshipped on, how does that correlate, how does that correspond to our present wheel of the year. You may find that working with all of the deities of that pantheon works for you, or you may find that you're only drawn to one. Either of these is totally fine. Now, here are some common pantheons that you can explore, and some of these you're going to know, and some of these you may not know very much about. And if they pique your interest, I encourage you to do some research. One of the things I know about witches is many witches, shouldn't say all, but many witches love to read and they love to do research. So here's some things you can research. So different pantheons include the Celtic pantheon, the Egyptian pantheon, like I mentioned, the Greek and Roman pantheons, the Norse and Scandinavian pantheons, Mesopotamian pantheons, Sumerian, Babylonian, the Hindu pantheon. You can study the Orishas of West Africa, the Aztec Mayan pantheons, Chinese and Japanese deities. So there's just a lot of options that you can choose from. And so I recommend is just learn as much as you can about mythology. Now, there is a beautiful book that is called Parallel Myths. It's a book that we read long ago in the Boston Pagan Alliance back when I lived there. I believe that's where we read it. And it is a book that sort of talks about how parallel some of the myths are across the different pantheons. So if you're particularly interested in how the pantheons intersect, that can also be a really good book. That one's called Parallel Myths. But if you're really just interested in one or two pantheons, I would recommend just researching those as much as you can and being really open-minded about it, and see which deities seem to be kind of tapping you on the shoulder during that process. Now, a second method that you can use to find a deity is to work with a specific archetype. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in episodes 110 and 113, I go into, these are two full-length episodes that go into this, so I'm only going to briefly mention it here. But it really depends on what your intention is. So let's suppose a person is doing shadow work. They might then decide that they want to work with the archetype of the underworld god or goddess. They may find that deities like Persephone and Hel and Ereshkigal they're very drawn to those deities, or Rhiannon, Caradwyn, even Epona has a story where she goes down into the underworld. Hades, Pluto, or Osiris. So there's a lot of possibilities, and when you're working with the archetype, you study all of the deities together. And so you may find that on one occasion you feel drawn to Persephone, perhaps in your shadow work, and in another occasion you may be drawn to Caradwen, or you may be drawn to Hades. And each one is going to have something a little bit different to offer you. Now, if you are working with, let's say you're working with grounding, you maybe want to work with your root chakra, then you might look to earth-based deities like Gaia, Isis, Tiamat, Modron, Danu. So lots and lots of possibilities, and the possibilities are as endless as, or they're only limited by the number of intentions that you can come up with. So if you are interested in working with archetypes, like I said, check out episode 110 and 113. I'll probably drop them in the chat in just a bit. And those who are watching back on YouTube later, you're going to find those two links to those two episodes in the comments. What you may find is as you work with one, let's say you have one intention, perhaps you're trying to find love in your life and you start to work with some of the love deities, you may find through working with multiple love deities that one kind of stands out. And then that deity goes on to become a patron. So let's now talk about what it means to be a patron, how to find a patron, different ideas like that. And then we're going to talk about ways to connect and how to give offerings to deities. Oh, Taliesin said he was rear-ended yesterday too. Must be in the air. Oh goodness. Okay. So it looks like maybe the live had frozen for a moment, but hopefully it's working again. Okay. Okay, and the people are liking the Wonder Woman shirt. It's actually Wonder Witch. It's the Wonder Witch shirt from Salem. And now I'm mad because I wish I'd gotten, there were so many different designs there when I was in Salem a couple of weeks ago. I wish I'd bought more of them. I just got this one, but this is the Wonder Witch shirt from Salem. Sonia said she thinks she's been called by both Mother and Isis recently. Yeah, and Isis is a mother goddess, so that makes a lot of sense too. I feel like I've been called by Isis recently too. She's one on my list of deities I'd like to start working with. So, okay, so let's talk about patrons. Okay, so patrons. Now, some people may choose to honor a patron somewhere in their work. Patrons are basically deities that, if you kind of think about the relationship of the monotheistic God to the practitioners of the monotheistic religions, if you were Christian, if you grew up in a monotheistic religion, kind of think about that relationship. So it's the deity that you spend the majority of your time kind of working with. You make offerings to them, you pray to them, you talk to them. So a deity, you can have more than one patron. But some deity, a deity or multiple deities, may make themselves known to you, and there might be something about them that just resonates. So suppose you are doing some studies of a pantheon and just this one kind of deity pops out, or like Sonia was saying, kind of like the mother goddess and Isis is sort of like she's being called towards that. So that's sort of hearing the call, right? They may specifically seek you out. So there are many stories of people sort of getting that tapping on the shoulder from a deity. I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again. When I was somewhere in the kind of the middle of my path, this is after I moved to Los Angeles, and I was exploring other options besides witchcraft and Wicca, and I was going to the OTO temple, and at some point I ended up at the Corlucius temple. And I remember one day we were doing a meditation, and I don't even remember what the meditation was about, but during the meditation this word was whispered in my ear, and the word was Epona. And I didn't know who Epona was. I had never, at that point I hadn't played some of the Zelda games. I did not know this deity at all, and so I went home again, began to do some research on Epona, and I came to learn that she was a Celtic Gallic deity of horses. who was so popular that she was one of the few deities that Rome actually worshipped in her exact form, rather than sort of transforming her into a Roman deity. They worshipped her in her Celtic form. And there are many stables in the old Roman Empire that were dedicated to Epona. So anyway, I'm not somebody who's connected to horses. Hadn't ever been in my life, and here's this word sort of being whispered in my ear. And that began this long relationship that I had with Epona. So sometimes the deities may make themselves known in that way, by sort of coming to you in a meditation, coming to you in a dream, coming to you through synchronous experiences out in the world. It could be like you're at a store and something kind of just pops out at you at the store, or maybe if you're at a metaphysical shop, for example, maybe the owner sort of shows you something, and it's synchronous because it's related to a deity that's sort of kind of there in the periphery, sort of waiting for you to hear. So I believe that many of us, those of us who come to this polytheistic path, we may be working with one or two deities, but there's probably many outside of us that also are open to working with us as well. And we just need to sort of listen, and we need to find the right time and the right space for that working to begin. Now, the deity may have something to teach you, something to show you. It may be connected to that specific time that you're in at that moment, or it may be more of a lifelong relationship. But whatever it is, it's important for us to kind of listen to that. So even if you're not prepared to work with that deity, or you don't know how to work with that deity, just filing it away in your mind or writing it down for the future. Like, let me do some research on this deity. During a dream meditation with the great Robert Moss, who was a great meditative leader, I had an image of the god Anubis. And this is not a god that I have worked with previously, and it's not really a god that's is very similar to some of the other gods and goddesses that I work with, but nevertheless, it's a deity that I've kind of filed away. There's some work to be done with that deity. So similar things have happened with like the goddess Isis. That is a deity that's been coming to me a lot, or Kuan Yin for years. I've sort of had like this energy of Kuan Yin around me, but yet she is not a deity that I have started working with. Currently, I mostly work with Lakshmi and Ganesha and Kali, and I do still work with Epona. And then more recently, through being at a metaphysical shop, I've sort of had this kind of synchronous moment with the goddess Oshun. So there's a lot of ways that the deities can come to us. When you choose a patron deity, you can think of yourself in lots of ways as a dedicated priest or priestess to that deity, sort of carrying out their work, keeping them alive, in this world, keeping their memory here. For those of you who have watched or read the book American Gods, or watched the series, it's a fantastic series, and the book is fantastic too. But the idea is that the gods sort of lose power as people stop working with them. Now, I don't believe that that's actually totally true. It's fictional work, but I do think that from working with deities, I do think that there is this great desire for people to continue to work with them, even in a world that's sort of turned away from many of the old gods. So you become this dedicated priest or priestess on that path, keeping their practices alive and working with them. And I just think it evolves into a very powerful relationship. Now, not everyone will find a patron deity this way, though. Not everybody, people will say, well, what happens if I don't hear that whisper in my ear, or I don't have those synchronous moments? It's always okay to just pick a deity. If there's one that you're just interested in, just because you're interested in that deity, that's okay too. You can pick one later may choose you. Just really be open and receptive and know that you can have more than one. So, If you haven't found a patron deity yet, that's also okay as well. As I mentioned earlier, you can work with the great goddess, and you can work with the great god. You can work with the triple goddess. You can work with the mother goddess. You can work with these archetypes, and that is also a way that you can kind of work with them during ritual as you sort of wait for a patron deity to make themselves known to you. Now, I say don't worry. One will approach you in time. So if you feel like none has approached you yet, don't worry. I do feel that everybody who is open to working with deity will come to you. And in fact, it's very hard for me, when we approach deities with honor and respect and curiosity and openness. I would venture to say there's very few deities, if any, that would reject a person. The only way that a deity might um, uh, have some resistance to working with a person is if the person just isn't ready for that, whatever that thing is in their soul purpose or their life goals, and they're just not ready for that thing yet, in which case the deity would say, wait, work with me later, and perhaps could direct you to a different one. Um, but don't worry, everyone has the opportunity to work with deity. And so let us now just segue a few other topics before we kind of move into the Q&A, is the idea of how do we work with them. So how would we work with deities once we've picked one, or let's say we haven't really found a patron yet and we're just choosing to work with like Great Mother or Great Father or something like that. So the first thing we can do is we can work with them through ritual. So these can be simple rituals to honor the deity. They don't have to be big and elaborate. They can be big and elaborate, and you can invite them to attend your big elaborate rituals. But you can also have very, very simple rituals where you sit at your altar, you light a candle, perhaps you chant or you sing or you just talk to the deity. So this can be a way, a very profound way to begin a relationship with them. So just like with the ancestors, when you're trying to connect to them and you haven't had any connection to them yet, it's recommended that you just light a candle and sit and talk to them. So same goes with the deity. And also knowing too that there are other ways that we can deepen that experience. But at the very, very basic level, it's all you really have to do is just sit and talk to them and be open. Now, you can also work with them in a kind of a very deep meditative state or in a journeying meditation. So within our Shadow Seekers membership, and then also in our in many of the rituals that we do in our coven, we work with different deities, at different times of the cycle, at different rituals. And during those rituals, we often will have journeying meditations that give people an opportunity to kind of go into a meditative state and meet that deity. And so there are many people who have come to these rituals who do these meditations and afterwards are like, wow, I didn't really know about that deity, but I feel like I have a connection to them. And then they go on and they begin working with them and they begin to create and forge a relationship with that deity. So if there's a deity that you're particularly interested in, you can look for meditation. Let's say it's Hecate, or it is Osiris, or whatever deity, Isis. Just look for on YouTube meditations for, and then put in the name of the deity and see what comes up. And the only thing I say is just find somebody's voice that you like, and then take the journey and see what comes up for you. And that can be a really great way to work with them. Now, another thing you can do is if you don't want to do the kind of guided meditation, you can also get something like a insight timer where you can just play music in the background. You can set a timer. I'm going to meditate for like 15 minutes, set the timer on there, and then just go into a meditative state and then just open yourself up to the experience of the deity and then see what comes through. Now, another way you can work with deity is through prayers. Prayers are not just for the Abrahamic religions. And if you have sort of some PTSD from having been part of an Abrahamic religion and you don't like the word prayer, just insert a different word. But it's basically sending petitions, sending thoughts and energy to the deity, asking them for help with things, asking them for guidance is essentially what prayer is, right? And that can be a really good way to work with the deities as well. Now, you can work with them through embodying their characteristics. So, the positive characteristics that you see in different deities, you can bring out into your own life. So, if you are looking for courage, you can work with warrior deities, and you can channel that warrior energy and think about what it would mean to be like Athena, right? What are the qualities that she has? Learn her stories, and then channel that energy into your own life as you become a warrior in whatever cause it is that you need that energy for. If you're looking to be a mother, channel mother energy. Or if you're looking to strengthen your mother energy within you with your own children, pick a deity, a mother deity, and kind of channel that energy and begin to embody the traits of that goddess or that god. You can also leave offerings for the deities and listen to what they want, and you can also do research. So if you are looking for offerings for Hecate, Google offerings for Hecate, or ask people who work with Hecate what they offer her. Same goes for any deities. But you can also Google and you'll find nice lists of offerings. Now, when in doubt, you can always use, there's kind of standard offerings, like water is a standard offering, coins is usually a standard offering, flowers, wine. Those tend to be standard offerings. But you can also, like with offerings to the ancestors, you can use your intuition. Listen, like ask the deity in that when you're having that conversation with them, what would you like to be offered? And then listen and don't second guess yourself. So it's the way that this has to work. If you're going to try this, but you're going to negate everything that comes through because you just don't believe in yourself, then I would recommend doing some solar plexus work, working on self-belief, and kind of making a deal with yourself, like I'm going to try to get over that so that I can forge a stronger relationship with my intuition and with the energies outside of me. But listen for the first thing that pops into your head and go with that as an offering. And then the one thing I would say, though, is that some deities have specific desires. So, for example, there with Oshun, something I learned about working with her is that it's part of her mythology. There is poisoning. And so if you want to offer her food, you need to taste the food first before you offer it as an act of reverence. Another thing I know from working with Venus is she is the goddess of love and beauty. And while there are some deities who are perfectly fine accepting like dead flowers, like Lilith, she likes dried flowers. But Venus does not. Aphrodite does not. Prefers fresh flowers. So you can do research. Kind of as you research the myths, you'll sort of learn more about their story, and that can also help guide you into the offerings. When in doubt, just do standard offerings like coins, wine, water. Okay, another thing that you can do is study their myths. That is what I mentioned earlier. You'll begin to learn more about the deities. It is a way to honor them is through studying their myths. And you can also set up an altar that is specifically for that patron. So also something I will say is that I've been asked this question before. If you don't have a lot of space, can you set up an altar that has like space for more than one deity on it? And I say the answer is yes. With a caveat is that you want to do some research, make sure that the two deities wouldn't be in like opposition to each other. They don't have like some rift or something in mythology that would cause there to be problems with them sharing the same altar. But you can, we don't have like a lot of space in the house. And so we do have some altars where there are multiple deities on that altar, especially if that altar is for a specific intention. And then those deities that sort of commingle there are all aiding the energy of that intention. But you can set up that altar specifically for them. If you don't have space for an altar, a really quick idea is just the top of a bookshelf. You can put a little cloth over it, a candle, and you got an altar. And then another idea that I saw Jezadora mention in the Body Mind Witchcraft group yesterday or the day before is if you really don't have space for an altar, or perhaps you live with people where you can't leave an altar out, you can also have an altar in a box. So you just put everything in the box that's for that altar. You can bring it out at certain times and set it up, but then you can put it back in the box and put it away, and nobody has to know about it. That's also very good for somebody who has a very small, limited space. So the other thing I wanted to sort of end with here is just working with deities in, from a modern context. These deities are very old. Some have been worshipped for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And so it's worth looking into how they were worshipped. If you can find actual hymns or actual chants that were used for that deity, I think that it is great to make up your own, to write your own evocations as you learn more about the deity that you're working with. But if you can also find like the old way that deities were called. I find this particularly powerful when I'm working with Lakshmi and Ganesha and Kali, because there are people other than neopagans who worship those deities in large, large, large numbers, right, in the Hindu faith. And so these are deities who are actively worked with, but these are also deities who have hymns and prayers and chants and mantras that were written about them that go back a long, long time. And so if you can find those, if you can learn a little bit about the language, like how the vowels were pronounced, and get good at pronouncing the chants or these incantations, it adds this extra layer to it that I've really appreciated over the years. I didn't always do this, but when I started working with those deities in particular, I started researching more how were these deities called in their own language, and trying to learn that. So that is kind of what I have to present today about working with deities. But I'd love to hear other people's ideas. How do you work with deities? Who do you work with? Do you work with more than one? So feel free to share in the chat, whether you're live or you're going to be watching this back later. So I'm just going to pause now and look at the chat here, and I see Sonia said Pachamama, Mother Goddess. I love Pachamama. I have a cat named Pachamama, and I have worked with Pachamama as well. We often will work with her at Mabon. She's one of my favorites. And Sonia said Anubis too. Sabrina said she learned Atira is corn. She is a native, a mother. Yeah, so it's really interesting too as you research and you expand out. Like that's one that I had never heard of. So there's just so many, right? So even when we've been on the path for a long, long time, there's so many to learn about. And then Andrea said there's some really cute ideas online for altars in a box. Oh, that's cool. Yeah, that I will have to look up for those too. And then Andrea said she loves to use some of Hecate's epithets in her rituals. That is another thing I should have mentioned. So I'm glad you reminded me. Yeah, with epithets, which are the names that they were used. Some deities, have hundreds and hundreds of different names that were used. And that's one of the things that I really like when I'm writing my own evocations, is to find out what epithets were used, what did people call that deity, what were the other names that were used, and then I incorporate those into my evocations. Kurt said Diana and Celine are his favorites. Yeah, there's just so many to choose from, and just because we work with certain ones right now doesn't mean those will always be the only ones we work with. I'm always kind of open, and like I mentioned, I've got like Oshun and Anubis and Kuan Yin and Isis, and there's other ones sort of in the periphery that I know that I will eventually work with. Within my own practice, like I mentioned, I primarily work with Kali, Lakshmi, and Ganesha. And but when I'm leading people in circles, as our coven is an eclectic traditional Wiccan coven, and all the work we do in Shadow Seekers is very eclectic. I've called many deities over the years. So such energy. I love working with each one, and sometimes, I will pick a deity that is for kind of the group, and it's not necessarily one that I'm ever going to work with, but sometimes we pick one for the group, and then I eventually sort of begin working with that deity too. That's actually how I found Lakshmi. It was someone else in our coven years ago wanted to work with her, and so we started working with her at some of the rituals, and then I was like, wow. She eventually became kind of a patron of our house because we were calling her at all these different rituals. So just so many opportunities to work with the gods. It's such an exciting exciting topic to talk about. All right, so let us go into the Q&A now. So I don't really have any questions that were left for me this week, but there is a question from last week that I already answered this question, but I liked it a lot, and I knew other people might want to hear the answer to it, so I'm going to share it tonight. And if you're live, you can leave questions, comments in the chat. It can be about anything related to shadow work, witchcraft, or energy work. It doesn't have to be about deities. And if you are watching back in replay, leave your questions too, because I do go back and I answer these afterwards, as you can see from this one. So this question is from Patrick, and he said, do you believe that we have DNA ancestors as well as consciousness ancestors? And so I asked him a little bit more about what he meant to make sure we were on the same page. And what we're both talking about here are deities that are I shouldn't say deities, are ancestors that are not of our bloodline. So the question is, do we have other ancestors? And I think this is an important question for people who, number one, are looking for more ancestors to work with, or just ancestors in general to work with. And number two, people who don't think, maybe they're not all that close to their blood family, or really, as they became a witch, don't really resonate with or think that their ancestors would be open to talking to them from their perspective as a witch. So yes, I absolutely believe that there are other ancestors than just our blood ones. And I am somebody who comes from a family where it's hard for me to imagine what ancestors I could even call upon from my own blood family. Now, Christopher Penczak, in his book, The Mighty Dead, which is a fantastic book for anybody who wants to work with ancestors, this book goes into multiple different types of ancestors. So the first one is the blood ancestors, the ancestors or ancestors that you might have through adoption, because you grow up in a family that you sort of adopt as your family, and that family has ancestors. You can absolutely be connected to those. So those all kind of fall into this sort of blood ancestor category. He calls them the genetic kin. Those are the ancestors of flesh and bone. But he also talks about the adopted kin. And this isn't necessarily the kin that you receive because you're an adopted person, because you were adopted as a child or at some point. This is kin that you have. He calls these the ancestors of milk and honey. And this is the kin that you have because of the families you've made in life. And what he says in the explanation of this type of ancestor is that many people on this path were rejected by their families, either rejected outright or know that they would be rejected if they tried to talk to them about spirituality or religion. For people like that, which tends to actually be more the majority of us than the minority of us, there are families that you choose in your life, and those families become as important, if not more important, than your blood family. And you know what I'm talking about, those of you who resonate with this. Now, those families can also have ancestors that become important to you. So if you have sort of like a friend's family that you adopted, or you kind of became part of their family, those ancestors are your ancestors too, and you can work with those. So it's not just about the ones that you were born with, it's about all the ones that you choose as you go along your life. Now, he also talks about ancestors of the land that you live on. These are called land kin, or ancestors of skin and bone. And these are the ancestors that lived on the land before you got here. And so it's so important for us, this is borrowed land, and it is so important, or we should say stolen land, right? In a lot of cases. And so the ancestors who lived on our land have so much to offer, and to learn about them, learn about the people who lived on the lands that you live on before you. And these can be powerful ancestors that you can connect to through your magic as well. Then he talks about the story kin. He calls these the ancestors of breath and bread. And these are the ancestors that you have a connection to through a vocation, that you have through an art that you practice, through interests that you have. So if you are a nurse, these are like the ancestors of other healers and nurses, right? If you are a teacher, the ancestors that have taught in the past. So everybody, all the interests that you have, the vocation, the path that you are on, these all open up and provide ancestors for you. And then finally, he talks about the pathkin, and these are the ancestors of spirit and soul. These are those who have walked the path like you, before you. These are the ancestors of the witches. So you also have those as ancestors. So I think it's really important, especially for those of us, like I know for me, it's kind of sad sometimes because I don't feel like I have a lot of blood ancestors to connect to. But the book, The Mighty Dead by Christopher Pinzak, opens up so much space for you to explore other types of ancestors and find connection. And we all can find ancestors in some way. So just wanted to share that with you guys because I thought it was such a good question, and I knew that more than just Patrick would want to know the answer to that. Okay, so I'm going to check the chat here. So Andrea asks, is there times in the moon cycles that help open up certain chakras more than other times? And she said, same goes with with shadow work. Yeah, I mean, with your shadow work, it really depends on you. Everybody's a little bit different. The majority of people tend to be a little more open and receptive to shadow work in the waning half of the cycle. That goes for the moon cycle, so the second half of the cycle from full to dark moon, but it also goes for the waning half of the year. As far as the chakras go, it's an interesting question. I think that I would have to do a little thinking about that one. Off the top of my head, I feel like for example, like the solar plexus, to me, it's easier to connect to the solar plexus when you're in the waxing half of the cycle. So when you're moving from new moon into full moon, and you have sort of like that upswing of energy, the solar plexus, it's easier to activate it during that time, but it doesn't mean that you can't work with it at other times. But I think that working with energy tends to be, especially if you're working with like kind of fast moving energy, that tends to be better during the waxing half of the cycle than the waning half. And the waning half is better for kind of more reflective work. So if I had to say, I would say sort of like upper chakras in the second half of the cycle, and the lower chakras in the first half of the cycle. But you can work with them at any time. But interesting question. I'm going to continue. Sometimes people will ask a question and I'm like, okay, I'm going to give an answer, but then now I'm going to think about it on my walk. And I bet I'm going to have another answer to add here very soon. Taliesin said, when I first started after leaving Christianity, he said I was more soul goddess worship. And he said it probably a response to patriarchal issues. Very common, yeah. And he said, I moved on to recognize the duality of the divine, the great mother and father, and started working with Caradwin as an aspect of the great mother. And he said it seems to evolve and shift. And it's very, what he said is very great. And he said, as a Wiccan, does that make sense? It absolutely makes sense. And it makes sense not just as a Wiccan, but as a non-Wiccan practitioner too. It does. It very much evolves. It's very common for people who leave a patriarchal religion to come to the goddess first. Very, very common. And sometimes never, ever even work with the divine masculine. But But eventually, over the course of kind of doing shadow work around certain various aspects, they may find their way to a god as well, and and or at least sort of work with both. Maybe the goddess being the primary one that they work with most of the time, but then having a god and a goddess at some of the rituals. So, but yeah, it makes perfect sense, and it is very true that it is something that evolves and shifts over time. And there may be a time when you start to work with both, and you're working with both all the time, and then you go back to just working with a goddess, and then maybe you're working with a god only, and it absolutely can shift like that. Um, all right. So if anybody's got any final questions, put them in the chat. I'm just going to let you know what's coming up. So coming up at the end of the week on 2/8 is our Imulk ritual elemental vows. We're doing our Imulk a little bit later this year. People were kind of a little, I got some messages over the weekend about where's the Imulk ritual. And we actually did an Imulk ritual in person here in Burbank, California on Saturday night. And I didn't have the energy to do two to lead two rituals back to back. So we had to make the decision to put the online one a week later. Our in-person one went fantastic. We sold the place out, and we've been asked to come back for Ostara, and so it was just an awesome experience. But now we're putting our energy into doing the online one on February 8th. Now, if you are in Shadow Seekers or Coven of Midnight's Flame, both of those groups, you have tickets to come to that. It's just part of your membership, so you can look for information in your email and in the membership. But if you would like to join us and you're not part of one of those two groups, you can get a ticket through donation. So I'm just going to drop a link in the chat where you can go and learn more about the ritual. We've done this ritual for the past 3 years now. This is our elemental vows ritual, one of my favorite rituals. It was really well received in person too. We had a flame oh, it was so cool. And we didn't even take any pictures, which I have to remember for next time. But this is going to be the online version of it. You will have the chance to connect to all 5 elements, and then write a series of elemental vows that will help guide you over the course of the next cycle or so, and give you a pathway of what you want to work with in your life. So if you would like to join us for that, and you're not part of one of our membership groups, go ahead and check out that link in the chat, and you can get a ticket through donation of any amount. Then on 2/11, I'm kind of working on redoing some of our best episodes that were done long ago, but have poor video quality. And that includes this one we're doing tonight, and we're going to be doing, I think, on 2/11, right in time for the full moon. I'm going to do an episode on full moon magic, so that would be next week, next Tuesday. And then on 2/18, I'm doing an episode on spell work, the keys to spell work. And then on 2/25, I think I'm going to do an episode on the dark moon or the new moon. I haven't decided yet, but just wanted to let you know. And then finally, to end, our Demystifying Witchcraft course is opening up soon. As of right now, it's only been available to those in our Shadow Seekers membership, but I keep getting people writing to me asking me, when is this coming out? And it is coming out soon. I know I say this all the time, but I'm making a great effort to have it out either later this month or by early March. So if you are not a student of that class and would like to be, that is a course. It is like 25 or 26 hours right now, and it continues to grow as I add to it. And it is based on all of the teachings and the trainings I do for my own in-person coven. Those who purchase that course and complete that course will have the option to join and initiate into our online coven as well. And then our Shadow Seekers membership is opening up probably sometime next month. So if you have been wanting to join us in Shadow Seekers and take your kind of path to the next level, that is something you might also want to look into. All right, so let me see if there's any final questions for me. I don't see any. Actually, I see one here. Let me answer this one. Glitter said she has a question from episode 122. She said, you talked about creating an affirmation jar to help negate negative self-talk. She said, my question is, how would be best to treat repeated negative thoughts already placed in the jar? For example, concerns about having enough money. Okay, good question. So if it's something that you find that it's always repeating in your mind, and let's say you've already put it in the jar, one option is you continue to make different affirmations where you negate it in different ways and you put those back in the jar. That way, you don't just have one kind of affirmation in the jar about money. You have multiple ones, especially if it's something that it's a repeated concern. You would want more affirmations about the more repeated kind of concerns that are more difficult to get rid of. So that's what I would probably say is just put, yeah, she said that's what I was thinking. Yeah, I would just put every time it comes up, just make a slightly different one so that you have a bunch in there. And then when you're drawing from the jar, you'll have a good chance that you get one of those. That's what I would do though. Okay, so I'm going to sign off for tonight. As always, it's always so great spending Tuesday evenings with everybody. And if you like what you hear, leave a heart somewhere in the video or a thumbs up. It just helps us get it to the feed of more people. You can leave questions and comments. Even if you're watching this back later, I go back through the feed and I answer anything that I missed while we were live. And then make sure to subscribe to our Body Mind Witchcraft YouTube channel. And that way you will not miss any future episodes. All right, until next time, blessed be.